Good afternoon and welcome. This is part of our energy transition series. This session is called The Storage Conundrum, Production versus Waste. And again, welcome to you all here in the room, but also all of you from all around the world. For those that are watching this from your screens, please don't forget to answer questions through that medium. Before I welcome our guest and our panelist, Brad Plumer, on stage, I would just like to play a very short video, and thanks again to Siemens Energy for sponsoring this session. Thank you.
Making a difference means to me to lead by example. I go to work by bike every day to reduce my carbon footprint. My name is Katrin Wickern. I work in Recklinghausen for Siemens Energy as a design engineer. To tackle climate change means to be creative. It's a problem to store a big amount from renewable energy. We have the responsibility to deliver solutions. Their big motivator is my younger brother. He was part of my change. He is an active member of the Fridays for Future movement. We have big discussions about the climate change. I am proud that even if I am just a small piece of the puzzle, I can make a difference.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us for our session on the storage conundrum. Yeah, we can sit down. I'm Brad Plumer. I'm a climate reporter for the New York Times, where I focus on technologies and policies to reduce emissions, which is ultimately what we need to do to tackle climate change. And our panel today, we're going to be talking about energy storage in all its facets. Here in person, we have Merlin Hyman. Sorry, they took down the bios from the screen, but that's fine. We can.
I can introduce myself, bro.
Okay, yeah. You know what? Why don't you guys just do a quick introduction?
So yeah, Merlin Hyman from Regen, which is Regen's mission is accelerating the transition to net zero energy. We're a kind of center of expertise, think tank, if you like. But perhaps most relevant to today's discussion is we run the Electricity Storage Network, which is the UK's kind of association of electricity storage. So over 50 companies who are kind of right now out there building projects, connecting them to the grid, providing services to the electricity system to match up with renewables.
That's great. And virtually joining us, Elizabeth Nyeko, do you want to just tell us a bit about what you're focused on, very briefly, and then we'll go to Tom and we'll start.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm the founder of a company called Modularity Grid. So Nyeko focus on providing software for intelligently managing the health and performance of distributed energy resources, so specifically looking at mini-grids in low-income countries, but also EV charging infrastructure for the off-grid rural context.
Okay, that's great. And we have Tom Rand. Just a little bit about yourself.
Sure, Tom Rand. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of ArcTern Ventures. We're a clean tech-focused venture fund. We have offices in Oslo, San Francisco, Toronto, Montreal. And we invest aggressively in next-generation clean energy technologies. So not a solar farm, but a next-generation solar panel. Not an energy storage project, but energy storage technologies. And on the side, I write books about climate and clean tech.
That's great. So today we're going to talk a little bit about energy storage. I think it's well known that we have both seen a really impressive rise in wind and solar power over the past decade, and you know, there's broad agreement that if we really want to transition away from fossil fuels, wind and solar are going to have to play a huge role in that transition. But it's also well known that it's not always windy, the sun goes down at night, and you know, it may be really crucial to find ways to store electricity for use when we need it. But there are a lot of issues around how storage can work, what sorts of policies can make it work, and also what we do about the waste at the end and some of the other issues. So I wanted to kick things off. Merlin, maybe you could tell us a bit, because you work a lot in the UK, which is making a big transition away from coal, why energy storage has been, you know, what important role it can play in that transition.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I mean, storage has often been seen or talked about as the kind of magic bullet in a net zero electricity system. So here in the UK, we've now set a target for 2035 for net zero power. So essentially that means generating power without, you know, any fossil fuels. Gas, coal, you know, these things which have sort of been, I don't know, powered our lives for, what, a couple of hundred years now, and we're talking about within 12, 13, 14 years, complete elimination. So it's pretty, you know, it's an ambitious goal, and it's still, we've made quite a lot of progress in the UK, but it's still a big shift. But obviously enough, when you're thinking about a high renewables system, particularly in a kind of, you know, in a sort of developed country grid context, different in developing countries, you know, you come back to the obvious question in the end is what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? And people have been asking that question for a long time, and it's turned out we can get quite a long way on renewables and integrating them within our grids. We have getting up to 40 towards 50% here in the UK. But as you get more and more renewables, which is variable, it's not dispatchable in the jargon, you need to match that up with storage and other forms of flexibility. And we've made some tremendous progress in the last few years, so we've now got over 1 gigawatt of storage on the UK electricity system, providing services mainly to the system operator to kind of help manage the system. That's all at the moment batteries. And what that is doing is really sort of intraday, short-term kind of storage. So it's, you know, it's sort of keeping the system stable during the day. There is going to be a need for a great deal more of that. We might be talking 10, 20 gigawatts as part of that 25 to 35 net zero power system. So there's a huge amount of investment and focus going into that in the UK right now. And we'll need other forms. We'll need demand-side response. We'll need interconnection with other countries. You know, we're going to need smart technologies to maximize the efficiency of our networks. But storage can be a key part of that. So that's more of the short term, and that's kind of batteries. Probably the bigger challenge, and the thing which batteries don't help you very much with, is the long-term storage, the seasonal storage. What happens in the week, that cold week in January? Those of you who know the UK climate well will know there are definitely some of those, and there's no wind. Maybe there's no wind low wind across the whole of kind of North Europe. And that you need longer-term solutions, and there's various runners and riders that are kind of people are thinking of as answering that question. So yeah, storage is the magic bullet in achieving the kind of high renewables net zero power system that this whole COP, you know, the whole day at COP today, this whole COP, you know, everyone is talking about. Storage is critical to that, but there are different forms of storage and flex that we need. Some are very short-term, intraday, smooth things out, deal with frequency problems. Some are much longer term to address the sort of seasonal need that we have when, you know, for those periods where we need a lot of energy, but the wind isn't blowing.
So that really helps set the stage. And obviously the UK is a very wealthy country. Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you, because you've been doing a lot of work on electricity access in the developing world and mini grids, which are often, a hybrid of different generating technologies and storage. Tell us a little bit about how storage can be really important for improving electricity access in countries that need more energy and more electricity, because it's an essential of modern life.
Yeah, absolutely. Storage is incredibly important in the off-grid context. And specifically when talking about mini-grids. So what a mini-grid is essentially a system that combines energy generation, storage, and distribution. So all of that end-to-end infrastructure is typically owned by one private company that installs it and then manages it. So it's a context where actually people are currently defining the future of what energy, of what kind of the energy system will look like, because it's still in its very early stages in terms of just these types of systems being set up. People are trying to work out new business models and ways of essentially handling all of that kind of upfront infrastructure investment and still being able to deliver a commercially viable business that can still, deliver that goal of energy access. So it's actually a context where it's really important to think about not just a transition per se, but actually just, how do we design a system for the future? How do we address people's energy needs and mobility needs and design it in a way that's low carbon, but also capable of growing with people's needs over time? So there's a lot of really interesting things to think about in that context. So storage in particular needs to be thought about in the off-grid context in a number of different ways, depending on the specific resources available in a location. So what does that mean? Let's say a location that has a lot of biomass, so agricultural production, instead of necessarily using batteries, perhaps having an approach using only batteries, perhaps having an approach where you combine battery storage with biomass generation could, in a sense, bridge that storage need for your system, because your storage ineffectively would be the feedstock that you keep in a warehouse that you then use as and when you need to run your system. Another approach, storage in other mini grids would be more in terms of having water pumping. So whenever you've got a certain amount of electricity that's not being used, making sure that you put that towards pumping water, then the water gets pumped and sits in a reservoir, and as and when it's needed, it's then used. So kind of thinking about storage in kind of very, very dynamic ways. But as far as battery storage in particular is concerned, lithium-ion batteries are definitely kind of a game changer for our mini grids. So we've provided software for managing mini grids, hybrid mini grids that combine biomass with batteries as well as solar. And we find that context, you're actually able to bring down the levelized cost of energy to a level that's more on par with the grid. So really making sure that people pay a lot less for their energy. But yeah, so it's actually the kind of off-grid context. I think the biggest challenge with storage is that roughly you end up spending about 30% of your CapEx. And if it's a battery, then you're thinking about roughly 90% of your total replacement costs every 5 years or so going towards the battery. So really making sure that they're managed properly and you protect the life of the asset becomes very, very important.
Yeah. That's great. So, Tom, I want to talk to you a bit. I mean, we've heard about why energy storage is important, and it would be really great to have a lot of it. Tell us a bit about some of the challenges in actually scaling it up, and maybe, whether we really know which technologies are going to win out, or whether that's something that's still very much in flux.
Yeah, good question. It's very much in flux for sure. When I think about that question of storage and scale, I think about scale from two perspectives. The first perspective is the size of the system itself. So hundreds of megawatts, tens of hours. There's a particular role those can play on the grid. And scale in terms of being able to deliver that solution, orders of magnitude greater amounts over a decade or two, right? So we have a serious problem with climate. We're talking terawatts. So scale in terms of being able to deliver. I'll give you an example. So our flagship, investment is a company called Hydrostore. It's basically an advanced compressed air energy storage. So a giant battery made out of air, rock, and water, essentially. Think of it like pumped hydro, but in reverse, so it's air underground. You can site it almost anywhere. So you mine a cavern and use air and water to store energy. What's interesting about it is its sheer scale. So we have projects under development in California that are 500 megawatts and 10 hours. It's 5 gigawatt hours. So that's a very particular role in the grid, right? So early market adoption would be things like transmission deferral. So in downtown LA, right now there's a lot of air conditioning and the grid is essentially crowded and it's traffic jam in the middle of the day. So you site these things near a substation and you fill it up all night, feed it all day. So there's early market adopters for these large systems. Over the long term, it's of course a giant battery for a big part of the grid. So you can, there's no ceiling to the amount of wind and solar you can put on, and the utility has the opportunity to act as the battery for that system. We have projects in the US under development where we're essentially taking a coal plant, you decommission it, you keep all the infrastructure except the burner, and you build a Hydrostore facility there, and that coal that was a coal plant now becomes a battery for that area. It gives the utility a role to play in decarbonizing that grid to 100%. So that's scale. I mean, big utility. These things are so big they can store kind of a nuclear plant all night long. That's to give you a sense of scale. But the other more important piece, I think, and those of us who are climate nerds, this is the important piece. How do you scale up delivery of those kinds of systems by a couple of orders of magnitude in a decade? The challenge with many new technologies that are coming into the market is the supply chains aren't robust, right? We know there's shortages of rare earth metals, and going to mine lithium. If we're really going to scale the industry 100 to 1,000 times, there's a supply chain problem in a lot of new technologies. And what I like about this thermomechanical solution, and there are others, is the supply chain is so robust. These are Baker Hughes. These are companies that essentially supply the oil and gas industry. And you're repurposing the same equipment, the same mining techniques that the mining sector uses, and so on, in a new way. So we call it systemic innovation. Take existing known products and materials, supply chains, put them together in a new way to generate a new product. So that's what I mean by scale. And that latter piece about the industry being able to grow is not a trivial problem. We can have success as an investor, a company can have success, you can deliver a bunch of projects, and you can make a lot of money, but can you deliver enough to mitigate climate risk in a decade or two? And that's another order of magnitude in terms of scalability, and that's one of the things that we're really focused on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Merlin, I'd be curious about your perspective on this. I mean, right now there are so many different ideas for storage technologies out there, and different ones have potentially different uses in different places. But what's your perspective on what looks promising, what we may need, what some of the challenges are?
Yeah, thank you. The lithium-ion battery has so far continued to dominate the actual deployed market. So we're talking, let's say, over a gigawatt of that put onto the UK system in the last two or 3 years. And what that is targeting is perhaps something that, when we think about this, we think about, okay, what happens when the wind's not blowing and we still got energy needs, and that's a big, that's the problem. We need a balanced supply and demand, and absolutely that's a challenge. But it turns out that as you get to a high renewables system, there are also what the system operators tend to refer as operability challenges. So it's not about the kind of half hour, it's about the sub-second frequency control of the grid and voltage and reactive power and all these kind of factors that engineers amongst you all will know and love that mean that the grid is operable. And what we saw in the UK during COVID, actually, there was a period where demand was very low, and so it was extremely sunny, actually, for those of us who are at home and were lucky enough to go out for walks and things. It was actually a kind of rather lovely spring here in the UK. So it was very sunny, good wind, and not a lot of demand. And we kind of saw the grid of the future. And the big cost driver was not actually matching supply and demand in a kind of half-hour period. It was like maintaining the operability. And the national grid here spent something like 700 million quid on balancing the system by kind of paying people to turn down generation. So So there's a big need for technology to address to make the system operable when we have very high renewables system. And I think probably what Tom's been talking about more is that kind of longer term storage over when you're into a few days and you're into seasonal areas. And as he says, we're still not at the point where there's a kind of, agreement on a technology solution. There's compressed air, liquid air, there's gravity-based ideas. And I guess the one that has a lot of traction at the moment is turning surplus renewables into hydrogen, storing that and using that to generate power afterwards. So we're not there yet. There are a number of promising technologies, and I'm pretty confident here in the UK actually that we can, in the next 13 years or so, we can get there. And probably what we'll do here in the UK and maybe a lot of other countries, we're probably just going to keep our gas fleet sitting there kind of, perhaps nationalised, perhaps heavily subsidised to sit there as a sort of backup, because as a sort of provide confidence, and hopefully we'll just use it less and less and less to the point where we go, actually, this smart, flexible system, lots of new storage technologies, clever stuff with people only charging their electric cars when there's lots of power, lots smarter controls, a much smarter system, when we really get confidence in that working. And for me, the biggest issue is not actually the technological one here. I think we have that coming forward, or the supply chain issues Tom's talked about, very important. But it's kind of confidence in policy makers and decision makers who are kind of used to saying, look, I've got what do I want? I'm the energy minister. What I really don't want to be is the person sitting in the hot seat when the lights go out, and maybe I don't know who that was in Texas. Tom might know better than I recently, but you really don't want to be that person. So someone's coming to you and saying, look, it's all right, we've got this smart system of the future, there's going to be lots of renewables, very decentralized, they're spread around, they're on rooftops, and we've got some storage, and people's EVs are charging and discharging, and it's all magically going to come together and produce this completely reliable system, and you minister, definitely won't be in the hot seat when the lights go out, and you're like, oh, well, and then someone else is offering you, I'll do a massive nuclear power station with a big red button. When it goes wrong, I can press that. At the moment, most ministers go, well, I like your smart, clever stuff. Smart sounds good to me, but I'd also quite like that big red button. So I think there's quite a long way to go in sort of confidence in what a high renewables net zero system with lots of storage, which I think we're definitely going to get to. But it's building confidence that can work is perhaps our biggest challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, certainly in countries like the UK, the US, one of the big challenges is making sure the lights never go out. And we don't always do a good job of that. I mean, Texas is a great example, but that's sort of a constant constraint on decarbonization. You want to reduce emissions, but by far the top priority is making sure electricity is not out. But Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you, I mean, the issues in countries that either don't have electricity or don't have reliable electricity are very different. There, the big challenge is making sure people do have reliable electricity. I was wondering if you could walk us through a bit some of the challenges in scaling up mini grids, and if you could help us think about where, in places that are still trying to improve their electricity access, where mini grids are useful and where they may have limits and other solutions like expanding the grid or other kinds of thinking may be needed.
Yeah, absolutely. So in developing countries, there are areas where there are grids, although grids that are perhaps don't have as much kind of generation capacity, and the grids tend to be unreliable as well. So extending the grid is costly, and it's not necessarily the solution that guarantees that lights will be on, even for people that are connected to the grid. And so in that context, I would actually say a lot of the solutions that we've already been talking about in this session would actually be incredibly relevant. So whether it's large-scale storage, plugging into the grid, and then just making use of additional renewable generation infrastructure, just the fact that a lot of countries that are, a lot of developing countries do have, whether it's biomass, whether it's solar, whether it's wind resources. And I would say that would certainly be something to look at. In the off-grid context, so mini-grids are ideal for places where, so I would actually say that they're ideal for places where you can't necessarily come up with a commercially viable excuse to extend the grid. Just because if you're going over to a village that has, let's say, 1,000 homes or so, and the cost of extending the grid will just end up being just completely prohibitive because the economic activity in that village just won't be able to cover the cost of extending the grid infrastructure. So that sort of a context would be a situation where setting up an independent, small-scale electricity generation and distribution infrastructure within there would be absolutely ideal. And so typically with in the sort of rural off-grid context, the biggest challenge, some of the biggest challenges around storage is definitely the cost of cost of batteries. It's a huge, still kind of a huge challenge. So in terms of deployment, the types of technologies that people are deploying vary hugely. No one has quite figured out what the sort of magic bullet is, but obviously lead-acid batteries tend to be super popular. You have the sort of centralized storage that sits and supports the whole mini-grid, so all the homes, businesses, etc. And then the other approach that we've been using actually in our projects are kind of standalone batteries that are connected through to an inverter, and then so these are for homes that are beyond the immediate reach of the distribution lines of the mini-grid. So you'd have the standalone smaller batteries that you install, and then that actually allows the people in those homes to be able to have things like refrigerators and that sort of thing, or businesses, etc., to be able to have electrical appliances, help them generate more revenue. And then the other thing that we actually got an innovation team project for to deploy is EV charging infrastructure. So an EV in the rural off-grid low-income context is kind of 3-wheeled vehicles and 2-wheeled vehicles, typically locally converted from running on petrol to running on electricity. And it's just purely because of necessity, because you probably won't even have a fuel station that sells diesel or petrol, for another 15 to 20 kilometers away. So it actually helps to be able to have that sort of infrastructure within the village, and to have those sorts of vehicles, because then you can charge it. So so the village that we're in has an electric ambulance, 3-wheel, able to carry people to the clinic, and then a smaller vehicle which handles the distribution of the batteries that go to homes that are beyond the 2-kilometer radius of the mini-grid. And so that's kind of a sort of a wireless distribution network, as it were, for electricity. And then within the mini-grid context, we have the mini-grid reaching the homes that are directly connected.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it kind of sounds like one of the takeaways is we shouldn't think of it as, there's the standard conventional grid here, and then there are sort of mini-grid technologies over here. In some cases, they'd overlap and really complement each other, and it's not always an either-or question. So, Tom, I wanted to ask a bit. Obviously, over the last 2 decades, we've seen enormous growth in wind and solar power, and that didn't just happen magically. It was policy-driven, it was technology-driven, but there were really strong policies in place in a number of countries, Germany first and the US, to sort of support the growth of these industries to the point where they could start to stand on their own. I get the sense that storage is probably going to be the same thing, that we're not just going to see storage proliferate magically without any sort of rethinking of policies and regulations. So could you talk us through a bit what needs to change in terms of the the way we approach electricity policies? What might we have to look at?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it relates to some of the previous comments, which I think are really good, right? I mean, if you're in charge of an energy system, it's not on your watch. You want to see the lights go out, and that's about transition. How do we incrementally change things? We can all see this bright future of distributed solid-state energy production and energy storage and so on, but there's an existing grid that has to operate, and there's a mandate to keep lights on. And so when we think about designing policies, Brad, around bringing in storage, we can imagine what a top-level policy might look like. You simply incentivize the existence of storage. You have RFPs from utilities that value, length and duration and ancillary services. To the point made earlier about frequency reg and so on. So you can put all that in place and say, let's just put some incentives, and those can be designed by policy wonks who know lots about it. There's one sitting on stage who can probably design up a pretty good one. I think the question is how you get from here to there, and what are some of the pockets in the market that you're able to deliver economic benefit while you do it, right? And so, transmission deferral is an example I've given. There are ways that utilities are beginning to think about storage as another asset. They've got solar panels, they've got windmills, they've got gas turbines, they've got nuclear plants, they've got storage facilities. And the more that entrepreneurs can bring to kind of, business-ready, financeable, robust solutions that give more optionality in terms of size, hours, physical instantiation, whatever, of storage as an asset, utilities can be probably pretty creative in finding ways to value that asset. They just need to understand it, and at the point, they have to rely on it. Once that's delivered, I think there's lots of nuance in ways storage can play roles that are useful today that leads to the kind of grid of tomorrow that we've all been talking about, whether it's a greenfield microgrid in a developing world or whether it's a creaky old thing in the UK that's getting modernized. I think storage has a role to play there. And I guess my point is that policy can be responsive to those nuances in the short term while we know what the policy would look like in the long term. It's not unlike a feed-in tariff at the utility level valuing the presence of storage.
Yeah, that's interesting. Merlin, is there anything you want to add to that or talk about any of the other challenges involved in?
Yeah, I mean, policy critical, and I'll answer to policy wonk if you want, Tom, as a
it's a compliment.
I take it as such. I mean, it's interesting. Look, as you say, we have a history of supporting renewables in many developed countries and other countries, and it was there were very high subsidies at the early stages to get the technology going. Offshore wind in the UK is a really interesting example of that, and we've seen tremendous. I mean, those policies have been very, very successful. I mean, they were been controversial in many ways, but they've driven the price down to the point where, certainly in the UK context, renewables, and in most of the world, renewables are now your cheapest way of generating power. They were a bit of a roller coaster. It was a pretty painful experience, and I was in that world for those years. And the subsidies, any policy is always a bit of a blunt instrument, and you have a subsidy level, and then clever people, like Tom and others invest in these areas, they come down in price, and suddenly the government thinks, oh, hang on, they're getting super profits, they're making too much money, and now they need to cut the subsidy, and then they cut it overnight, and suddenly the whole industry shuts down. And in this country, it was sometimes known as the solar coaster. You get a sort of massive installation of solar, and then it all shut down for a year while the subsidy went. So it's not a great way to build a sustainable market that attracts people like Tom's cash. So storage in this country actually has not had a subsidy so much. It has had, what has happened is the system operator has kind of opened up the market for the services it needs to run the system, to value the services that storage can provide. And investors have come on a market basis. So they haven't come on with any guarantee, as they did in renewables, of the amount of revenue they're going to be earning in 15 years or whatever. They've just come in, I reckon there's a need for flexibility on the UK system. I reckon if I've got a flexible asset on the UK system, I should be able to make some money out of that. And that actually has a lot of, if you can get that has a lot of advantages in policy terms, because you're not reliant so much on the minister changing their mind, or, it's a market solution. But part of the reason that's worked well in the UK storage, and the UK is quite unusual in the deregulation of our system. So, for example, utilities, which Tom's talking about owning the stuff in the States, are that the networks over here are banned from owning storage. They have to go out to the market. They have to provide, they have to say, set up a market saying, I need flexibility. This is my need. Who can provide it to me? So we've gone down a very different system here, and it's producing, in some ways, the advantage is having a big purchaser that says, I need loads of storage, I'm going to buy it, put it in my substation. It works quite well. This very deregulated market-based system we have in the UK does release a lot of entrepreneurship and innovation. It's a bit, it can go wrong sometimes, but so it's an interesting model over here. And I think, coming, as I say, I've just come out of Energy Day at COP and listening to the Minister of Indonesia talking about being 80% coal still and pointing out that he's got, 2,700 islands or whatever it is to get energy to. And you're realizing the scale of the challenge here in some places. And just the importance of of working it out in some places, that we can show that this works and give confidence and then provide that expertise to others is going to be critical. And the policy solutions won't be the same in every place, but I do think we can learn a lot from those countries that are in the lead in this, and then hope that we can help others to scale up and move much quicker, because that's what we're going to need. The scale of this transformation in the next few years needs to be incredibly rapid and huge.
Yeah. So I want to make sure we can get to some questions both from the audience and online, and I'll ask if we have questions online.
Yep. So the first question coming in from online is, what are the inequalities linked to clean energy storage and distribution, and how do we overcome them?
That's a good one. Elizabeth, I was going to ask you a different question, but do you want to take this one, or?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I will take that question, and I'll tie it into what Merlin was talking about around subsidies, so kind of like the thing in the off-grid context. So I would completely agree that subsidies actually are a terrible tool, especially for low-income countries or middle-income countries, especially if you're in that sort of context, because you've got governments that are having to struggle between making decisions about funding healthcare versus funding education, so some really, kind of fundamental questions that are being asked. So it definitely doesn't make sense for taxpayer funds to be taken and kind of used to subsidize it's private companies that are building building businesses that don't necessarily reinvest locally, right? So what makes a lot more sense in this context is to drive to create policies and these tools that drive kind of more market-based innovation, so incentivizing businesses and entrepreneurship, incentivizing them to create new business models, incentivizing them and helping them in other ways. So let's say, for example, tackle some of the challenges that they face, like high costs of importing particular bits of hardware, the customs that are being charged, looking at those, bringing that down, and just, taking that sort of an approach, a more pragmatic and practical approach, would actually make sure that the types of companies that are involved in energy access are truly invested in the goal of achieving energy access for people in these rural areas and delivering electricity crucially at a price that makes sense. So I complain about my energy bill, and I live in London. I complain, I talk about, oh gosh, I'm paying, a few, 12, 15, equivalent, let's say roughly 15 cents per kilowatt hour, and I think that's completely outrageous. I feel like I should be paying a lot less. But if I compare this to people who are earning $1 a day, ending up in a context where energy is being sold to them at 50 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's completely crazy the way that sort of context works, and even that sort of that's an example of one of the cheaper tariffs in the off-grid context. So subsidizing businesses that are kind of not necessarily doesn't necessarily drive them to create solutions that are cost effective and that are affordable and meet the kind of ability to pay of the end user. So that would actually be my take on that. So tying that into that question around inequalities around energy storage. So because the cost of storage, if you're relying on battery storage in particular, is so high, and a lot of the innovation that tends to happen is focusing on sort of large grid scale batteries rather than necessarily, and so the economics, so even though you hear people saying, oh yeah, cost of storage is going down, it's, the story is all really happy. Yes, that applies very much in for sort of large scale storage, but when you look at the economics for small mini grids and what the cost of storage works out as for lithium ion, the story is not so rosy quite yet. So which is why, now is sort of the time for people to still look at other options, as I was mentioning earlier, the kind of more mechanical storage, like, or just kind of things like, just things that are non-battery based storage solutions, essentially.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think we have time for one or two more from the audience. I think you had your hand up first. The microphone will come to you.
Hi, thank you so much. It was so interesting. But I wanted to ask you about the availability of the resources that go into building the batteries, because there has been a lot of talk of, mining of lithium. And so how do you prevent, causing, you're preventing one environmental catastrophe, but how do you make sure you don't cause another?
Yeah, that's a good one. Tom, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier. Do you want to expand a little more?
Well, sure. I mean, that's one. I mean, I think lithium ion, it's an entrenched player. It's going to be a major force in storage, and the issues of lithium mining are real, and I think there's just got to be good governance on that. One of my worries, though, is along those lines, is the limits of, if you're going to say I have to expand mining 40 times to service this market, that's a pretty big expansion of a material extraction industry. And that's why I think thermomechanical systems that are leveraging existing supply chains that are already robust, that are already supplying oil and gas, that need to get repurposed, they're already there, are probably a good way to start mitigating some of those effects.
Yeah. There are a lot of other questions. So you, sir, over there.
Hi. Firstly, just want to say thank you for the panel and the informed conversation. Ajay Alawalia, electrical engineer and strategist at Equinor. My question, I just wanted to expand on what Merlin was saying before and acknowledging where, well, in isolation, if we just consider storage, we're probably not seeing the full picture, because storage is merely a response to the flexibility in the system, whereby demand-side response and interconnectors are also part of that equation. And I think it's just important to recognize what that means in terms of balancing the equation. I think the other thing I just wanted to mention is, and clarify for everyone, is just understanding where is the best place to put the storage and how that's a function of how mature and how developed one's grid system is, depending on whether it's a distribution-based system or if it's a centralized-based system historically seen in the West. So I think that's an important fact that I just wanted to highlight and to see what the panel's thoughts were, particularly in relation to how policy will inform that, because ultimately these storage systems will need to be paid for somehow, and then someone will want a return on that. So depending on where the system or how mature the system is, what is the panel's view on where is the best place to put storage?
That's great. Merlin, you want to field that one?
Yeah, so good questions. I mean, the ideal as a policy wonk, the ideal policy, it tends, is to set out the outcome you want. And to your point about this is what the system needs is flexibility. It might need it at different time scales, and they need it in different places. And ideally, you set that out. You say, this is the need of the system. This is what the value is to me. And then you let the market, clever people like electrical engineers out there, come up with the best solution. And if the best solution turns out to be a very distributed system, all of us plugging our EVs in, or it turns out to be massive batteries and where coal-fired power stations were, then ideally you set up the policy in the market, you set market incentives to enable the private sector to respond. And none of us here really know the answer to that until until they try. So far in the UK, more large-scale centralized solutions are winning out against local, smaller-scale solutions because of ability to put the cost, etc., and the cost of. We did a trial of trying to enable a community energy aggregation of flexibility at a very local level, and just the cost of setting up all the metering and the kit just kind of blew the value out the window. So, but we just need to. I think we need to, set out the policies, keep testing out and trialing and testing these systems, and seeing what wins. And it may not be what we expect at the moment. I think, and that, if you think about the kinds of solutions out there, your point about the kind of smart and demand-side response, there are some brilliant ideas and solutions out there and some no-brainers, really. I saw a trial by Centrica over here of a local energy market down in Cornwall, where there's a fish processing factory owned by the local fishermen in Newlyn, which basically needs about an hour a day to produce the ice to then keep the fish free. But they don't really care what time of day they use that, that hour. And so if they can be incentivized to use power when there's a wind's blowing, etc., then the sun's shining, then they're quite happy with that. They don't need to, but at the moment they're not really, and so they just produce it whenever they happen, which might coincide with the peak. So lots of really smart ideas, but just to play back to the previous point very, very briefly, this smart stuff does, on a domestic level, does have the risk that if you have the Tesla and you have the app and you have the off-street parking and everything, you can earn money from powering your car. And if you don't have off-street parking, don't have smart meters, maybe don't have access to that kind of smart kit, you're probably stuck on the highest possible tariff and getting pretty stuffed and not so quite happy about this smart system of the future. So I think here there are some really big equitable issues associated with the way we design the policies and implement them.
These were really great questions. I wish we had time for more, but the timer says no more time. So I really thank you all for coming and listening to our panel, and thank you to the panelists, Merlin, Tom, and Elizabeth. This was a really great discussion, and the Climate Hub will be going on all day, so I hope you enjoy more panels here. Thank you all.